Summer 1943, Western Germany. Early morning. The air smelled of fuel and fear. At the Lutzen airfield, Luftwaffe pilots prepared for takeoff. From the west came a sound, low, heavy, and earth-shaking. It wasn't the familiar hum of flying fortresses. This sound was rougher, deeper, as if the sky itself was cracking under the weight of something enormous. "Was ist das?" one pilot asked. "Ein Donnerflugzeug." "Thunderbolt," another whispered. The Germans first met the P-47 Thunderbolt in the spring of 1943. It was enormous, almost twice the weight of their Bf-109s. It didn't turn sharply, didn't dive gracefully, but it didn't fall, didn't break, didn't vanish. When Focke-Wulfs opened fire, their rounds ricocheted off its armor like stones off a steel wall. "It looked too heavy to fly," wrote ace pilot Hermann Graf. But somehow it did, and it climbed like a hurricane. The Thunderbolt didn't fight elegantly. It endured. 6 tons of metal, a 2,000 horsepower Pratt Whitney engine, and 8 .50 caliber machine guns. Every burst it fired tore the silence apart, like thunder itself breaking the air. To German engineers raised on precision and beauty, the Thunderbolt was an insult to design, thick, blunt, and ugly. Yet beneath that clumsy skin hid a philosophy, simplicity built for survival. In the P-47, everything obeyed one rule. It doesn't have to be pretty, it just has to work. The Americans built machines to fight. We built them to impress, a German engineer would later admit. While the Luftwaffe struggled to stop the Allied bombing waves, the Thunderbolt became their shield. It escorted bombers from England to Berlin and back. Even riddled with holes, it came home. Pilots swore they'd seen P-47s return with torn wings, shredded fuselages, even missing cylinders, still flying. "It was the flying tank," said one German pilot. At Luftwaffe briefings, photographs of the new American fighter appeared. The commander of the Tschuk Jagdkorps warned his men, "If you see this one, don't dogfight. Dive away, or you won't live to tell." It was the first time German pilots were ordered not to engage. The Thunderbolt wasn't just an opponent, it was becoming a myth. When the P-47s appeared over the Rhine, it wasn't just an aircraft. It was a message. America had entered the war with all its factories. Their polished metal wings gleamed in the sunlight, as if the steel itself was laughing at the elegance of German design. They were not pilots, one observer said. They were drivers of factories in the sky. The Germans gave it a nickname, Der Bulldozer des Himmels, the bulldozer of the sky. At first, in mockery. Later, in fear. They didn't know yet that a year later they'd be standing around one of these monsters, stripping off its panels and realizing for the first time they hadn't lost in the air, but in the hangar, France, June 1944. After another raid on transport lines west of Paris, one P-47 Thunderbolt took a direct hit to its wing. The pilot, Lieutenant George Milton, 352nd Fighter Group, felt the fuel pressure dropping, but the engine still roared, refusing to die. He tried to make it to the channel, but below he saw a field, a small village. He brought her down, hard, rough, but she didn't explode. The landing gear folded, the propeller bit into the earth, and the Thunderbolt slid to a stop in the middle of the field. Within an hour, Wehrmacht soldiers surrounded the wreck. Their commander, Hauptmann Karl Meinecke, radioed Luftwaffe engineers. They arrived the next day, curious, cautious, and soon quietly amazed. The fuselage was pierced in several places, but the cockpit was intact. The instrument panel, untouched. The engine, still there, still whole. It looks like it crashed from arrogance, not weakness, one engineer murmured. The Thunderbolt didn't look broken. It looked asleep. They started with the wing. The metal thickness stunned them. Over 2.5 millimeters of duralumin, reinforced ribs, layers of anti-corrosion coating. A German officer whispered, "Das ist kein Flugzeug. Das ist ein Panzer mit Flügeln." This isn't an airplane. It's a tank with wings. They traced bullet holes, but most hadn't even pierced the first layer. Every panel was fastened with dozens of rivets, not built for grace, but for endurance. When they opened the canopy, the engineers froze. Everything inside was too simple. Levers big enough for gloved hands, labels printed clearly, nothing hidden behind codes or artistry. "An idiot could fly this," said mechanic Ernst Rolf. "Exactly," replied another. "That's why they have so many pilots." That single exchange revealed the truth. America didn't rely on aces. It built armies of competence. Then came the engine. Pratt Whitney R-2800. Double Wasp. A massive 18-cylinder radial beast, nearly a ton of metal. To Germans raised on the elegance of the Daimler-Benz DB605, it looked barbaric, a brute of steel and bolts. But when they examined it closer, they saw the double cooling system, the clean ventilation design, and above all, clarity. "It's crude," one engineer admitted, "and yet it works at any altitude." The Thunderbolt could climb to 30,000 feet, where German engines gasped for air. 3 days later, representatives from Focke-Wulf arrived. They studied the assembly and repair systems. Chief Engineer Dr. Gerhard Braun finally said, "They build like blacksmiths, but think like strategists." He pointed to the thick welds, to redundant cables and twin pumps. They don't trust elegance. They trust redundancy. In their report to Berlin, the Luftwaffe used a new word, Überkonstruktion, overconstruction, not meaning over-engineered, but overbuilt to live. The Americans didn't build planes to fly beautifully. They built them not to fall. It's not art, it's survival. A week later, the aircraft was partially restored. Test pilot Heinz Möller flew it. Expecting a lumbering monster, he found instead a steady, balanced aircraft. Responsive, predictable, alive. "It doesn't fly," he said afterward. "It glides like a storm cloud." He dove. The airspeed climbed instantly, but the frame didn't shudder. The wings didn't bend. After landing, he said quietly, "We cannot build this. Not in our war." In September 1944, the plane was sent to Rechlin, Germany's top testing center. There, inside a sealed hangar, the Thunderbolt became an object of reverent study. The Luftfahrtministerium report concluded, "Enemy aircraft P-47 represents a triumph of industrial design over artistic engineering." Translation: the enemy defeated us not with talent, but with machinery. Even the engineers admitted it grudgingly. Their fighters were like musical instruments, beautiful, precise, but fragile. The Thunderbolt was a hammer. It didn't understand failure, and for the first time, the word Neid, envy, appeared in a German report. When the Allies reached Paris, that same P-47 still stood in the hangar. On its side, someone had scrawled in chalk, "Der Donner kam, sah und flog davon." The thunder came, saw, and flew away. The camera pans over the abandoned field, grass swaying, a German helmet lying beside a wing, and a voice says softly, "They thought they had captured a machine. Instead, they had captured an idea." Rechlin, Germany, October 1944. Beyond the gates of the Luftwaffe's test center, a truck stood still under a grey morning sky. Its cargo, a captured American aircraft, mud still clinging to the tires, French dust coating its wings, and bullet scars tracing its skin. On its faded side, a white star. On the paperwork, one line. Feindflugzeug P-47. Zustand. Funktionsfähig. Enemy aircraft P-47. Condition. Operational. For the first time in the war, German engineers had received a Thunderbolt, almost intact. The order from Berlin was simple. Disassemble. Examine. Understand. Hangar 12. Nordhalle Test Complex. Cold air thick with oil and dust. On the concrete floor lay the enormous body of the Thunderbolt, like a whale dragged from the ocean of war. Dr. Walter Kramer, chief engineer from Focke-Wulf, entered first, lantern in hand. He paused, studying the machine's silhouette. "This is not an airplane," he said quietly. "This is a factory that flies." Around him stood the brightest minds of the Reich, mechanics, metallurgists, aerodynamicists. They approached the aircraft like surgeons before an autopsy. They removed the outer skin first. Beneath it stretched a maze of pipes, wires, and tubes, hundreds, perhaps thousands. And yet every one was numbered, labeled, standardized. "They built this to be built again," murmured technician Wilkie. In German aircraft, every component was handcrafted. If one broke, a new part had to be made by the same artisan. The Thunderbolt, by contrast, looked like a kit, ready for mass assembly by anyone with a wrench. Inside the cockpit, they found a dual electrical system, one circuit for instruments, another as backup. Every cable was shielded in glass fiber insulation. Kramer studied the wiring diagram. "They assume failure," he said. "That's genius." The Americans didn't believe in perfection. They designed for mistakes. It was the opposite of the German creed, where every bolt had to be flawless, every craftsman irreplaceable. The landing gear system shocked them with its simplicity. A single hydraulic pump, 2 backup valves, and a manual lever in case everything else failed. Engineer Brunner shook his head. "If this plane were built by us," he sighed, "it would never leave the factory on time." The Thunderbolt carried an armored capsule around its pilot, 12 mm of steel in front, 8 mm behind, and a 38 mm bullet-resistant windscreen. Weighing nearly 8 tons, it still outran the Bf-109. A German technician struck the glass canopy with a wrench. It didn't even crack. "This is a flying bunker," he muttered, and nervous laughter rippled through the hangar. They laid each part out on long tables, measuring, labeling, recording. Cables twice as thick as their own, rivets forged from tougher alloys, bolts that could survive fire. Everything seemed too much, but in that excess was logic. Build it strong enough to keep working while burning. Every piece bore the same mark. Property of Republic Aviation. Serial number, date, batch stamp. Proof of a system at work. Kramer stared at the rows of identical parts and said softly, "We can build 10 perfect planes. They build 10,000 good ones." For comparison, they rolled in a FW-190A8. The two machines stood side by side, grace versus gravity. The German fighter looked elegant, but its panels could only be removed by hand. Its wiring was a tangle. Even refueling required partial disassembly of the wing. The Thunderbolt, meanwhile, allowed an engine swap in half an hour. In America's logic, the man didn't need to be a genius. The system did. When they reached the turbo supercharger, the hall fell silent. It was enormous, the size of a small car engine, crafted from heat-resistant alloys and capable of keeping full power at 10 kilometers altitude. "This unit costs more than a small airplane," one technician said, "and they put one in every single fighter." It was a moment of revelation. America wasn't saving resources. It was outproducing limits themselves. In the Reclin Laboratory report, a new expression appeared. Mass over art. It wasn't mockery. It was admiration. The Thunderbolt was anti-German in spirit. Loud, heavy, inelegant, but practically immortal. "It's not made by artists," said Kramer. "It's made by a civilization that builds cities the way we build watches." By evening, the hangar was lined with its dismantled parts: fuselage, wings, engine, cockpit. One engineer ran his hand over the dented aluminum and whispered, "We are losing this war not in the sky, but in the factory." No one disagreed. Everyone already knew. The Germans saw a machine. What they found was America itself, built in aluminum and sweat. Rechlin, Germany. Late October 1944. The sky hung low and grey over the glass roof of the hangar. On the concrete floor sat an 18-cylinder heart of steel, oil-stained, pitted with bullet holes, yet somehow still alive. It was the Pratt Whitney R-2800 double Wasp, the most powerful piston engine of its time, 2,400 horsepower. The Americans mounted it on Thunderbolts, Corsairs, Hellcats, B-26s, even the Black Widow. Now, that heart lay on the enemy's table. German engineers surrounded it. Dr. Walter Kramer stood beside the turbo supercharger, his assistant Wilke unrolling a blueprint, a perfect metallic flower of 18 cylinders. "This is the engine that carries 8 tons of airplane," Kramer said. "Let's see how." They began measuring. Cylinder bore, 5.75 inches, 2 concentric rows of 9 cylinders, each one a small motor of its own. Pipes and conduits branched like veins, oil circulating through a system both complex and logical. The Germans were masters of liquid-cooled precision, delicate, efficient, and fragile. Here they saw something alien: air cooling. No radiators, no fragile lines, just aluminum, airflow, and confidence. "They cooled it with courage," one engineer muttered. That was the essence of American engineering, not to fear bulk if it meant survival. Kramer examined the rear of the engine. There, a forest of pipes fed the turbo supercharger, a monster spinning at 18,000-odd RPM. Nothing like it existed in the Reich. "This is how they reach 30,000 feet, said Brunner. "Without this, it's a whale. With it, it's a god." The turbine let the Thunderbolt breathe in the stratosphere where German fighters gasped for air. They tried to start it. After a few hesitant coughs, the turbine shrieked to life. The hangar walls trembled. A mechanic covered his ears. Another laughed nervously. "It sounds like industry itself screaming." Kramer didn't smile. He simply listened. Eyes closed, hands behind his back. "That sound," he said quietly, "is the sound of a country that builds without fear." When they opened the cylinders, they froze. Every component was numbered, labeled, standardized. Pistons could be swapped between engines with no fitting. For Germans, trained in the religion of craftsmanship, it bordered on heresy. No artisan's touch, just production line perfection. "You could build this by the thousands," said Wilke. "They did," Kramer replied. They examined the ignition. 2 magnetos, duplicate wiring, secondary oil feeds. No system depended fully on another. The Thunderbolt could lose half its cylinders and still fly home. "They designed it to survive mistakes," Kramer wrote. "That's not arrogance. That's wisdom." In the oil filter, they found thick black sludge, metal filings suspended in it, evidence of hundreds of flight hours, yet the engine had still run. "Our engines would seize long before this," Brunner said. "Ours are like violins. This one's a drum. Metallurgical analysis revealed alloys unknown in German inventories: nickel, chromium, molybdenum, metals forged in an industrial world beyond blockade. Tensile strength, over 80 kmK. They melt cities to build engines, whispered a technician. The Luftwaffe Ministerium report would later include one line: they sacrificed elegance for life expectancy. Germany built engines that demanded respect. America built engines that demanded fuel, and that difference was victory. Each R-2800 cost about $12,000. A German DB605 cost nearly the same, but Germany could build only one for every 10 the Americans produced. By late 1944, production of R-2800s surpassed 100,000 units. They didn't win with brilliance, Kramer wrote. They won with production. During compressor disassembly, engineer Fritz Hellmann whispered, "If we had built engines like this, we wouldn't need Hitler's speeches." No one answered. No one dared. But everyone agreed. That evening, Kramer made a final note in his journal. "This engine is a democracy of power. Every part supports the others. No single genius rules it." It was more than a technical conclusion. It was a cultural revelation. America hadn't just built airplanes, it had built a philosophy. They called it a machine, Kramer wrote, but what they forged was willpower in metal form. Rechlin, Germany, November 1944. Snow drifted down onto the hangar roof, muting the sound of hammer blows, rustling paper, and the hum of a diesel generator. The Thunderbolt no longer looked like an airplane. It was now an archive. Rows of parts, numbered diagrams, charts, photographs, and data sheets stacked like scripture. Dr. Walter Kramer stood by a chalkboard, a skeletal outline of the American aircraft sketched in white dust behind him. Dozens of engineers watched in silence. They all saw the same thing. This wasn't a machine. It was an organism. The Germans knew how to craft masterpieces. They could hand-turn a perfect gear, balance a propeller by feel, shape aluminum like art. But every aircraft they built was unique, a singular creation that needed a master's touch. The Thunderbolt was the opposite of art. It was a copy, and every copy was as strong as the first. "They build as if perfection can be mass-produced," said engineer Wilkie. There was no sarcasm in his voice, only awe and quiet dread. Kramer began collecting statistics. By his calculations, every Thunderbolt component could be produced in any American factory without hand-fitting. That meant one thing: the US had built a machine that made machines. "This isn't design," Kramer said. "It's an ecosystem." He held up a gear stamped R-2800A 1287. The same number appeared in Republic Aviation's parts catalog. Any mechanic, anywhere in America, could order a replacement and receive an identical piece to the micrometer. For a nation built on craftsmanship, it was nothing short of sorcery. "We're fighting an enemy we can't exhaust," murmured young engineer Franz Hoffmann. He was right. The Thunderbolt wasn't just a plane. It was a symptom of infinite production. Behind each P-47 stood not a genius designer, but a system, a nation, a network of factories, workers, and supply chains bound by one idea: build fast, build strong. Kramer ordered a WW190 brought in. When the German fighters' components were laid beside the Thunderbolts, the contrast was painful. The Focke-Wulf's parts were elegant, delicate, hand-fit like jewelry. The American ones looked coarse, but locked together like puzzle pieces. "We built watches," Kramer said. "They built tractors that fly." Laughter rippled through the hangar, bitter, self-aware. Weeks later, the engineers began to argue. Could brute practicality truly be called engineering? Some said yes, if it won wars. Others said no. It was the death of art. Kramer wrote a note on the board. Art makes men proud. Utility makes them free. No one answered. Germany lived by the ideal of perfection. America lived by the ideal of function. Between the two yawned a gulf wider than the Atlantic. They don't worship precision, said one engineer. They worship momentum. The Thunderbolt embodied that faith. Too heavy to be graceful, too loud to be elegant, too durable to be defeated. During a test, the team tried to bend a section of its wing skin. It didn't yield, even under the hammer. Brunner muttered, "This isn't aluminum. This is faith." Kramer looked at him. Maybe that's what we're missing. Kramer's comparison chart soon covered the wall. Parameter Thunderbolt FW190. Assembly time 12,000 hours, 35,000 hours. Production cost 50,000 RM, 110,000 RM output. Rate 1 every 2 hours, online, 1 per week. He stared at the numbers and whispered, "They don't just outfight us, they outproduce us." While German factories burned, American ones multiplied. The Thunderbolt was more than a weapon. It was geometry in steel, a design where failure simply disappeared inside the system. They designed their failure out of existence. Germany sought the ideal. America built resilience. "We work for the Führer," said a young mechanic. "They work for the foreman." That line cut deeper than any technical report. It captured the truth. America's power didn't come from leaders, but from workers. A month later, the engineers stopped calling the P-47 a Feindflugzeug, enemy aircraft. They began to call it der Riese, the giant. "It's not just a plane," one said. "It's a lesson in humility." In his private notebook, Kramer wrote, "I was trained to build beauty, but maybe true genius lies in what keeps moving after it's ugly." He closed the journal and looked at the dismantled parts glowing under the lamps. "We are engineers," he said softly, "but they are builders of endurance." In the ruins of their perfection, the Germans found their truth, and it sounded like an American engine. Rechlin, Germany, December 1944. The wind howled through the hangar doors. Outside, a white storm. Inside, the metallic chill of war stripped to its bones. In the center of the hall stood the P-47 Thunderbolt. No longer a mystery, no longer a captured prize, but a test subject. Sandbags piled on the floor. An MG-42 on a tripod. Officers of the Luftwaffe watched, notebooks in hand. On the blackboard, written in chalk, Testreihe 14, Beschuss tests. Test series number 14, ballistic evaluation. The first trial, the cockpit armor, the canopy removed, targets set, and the MG-131 opened fire from 100 meters. Sparks, smoke, the ringing clash of bullets. When the shooting stopped, engineers advanced. The glass was spiderwebbed, but unbroken. Bullets lodged, flattened, defeated. One officer struck the canopy with his fist. A cockpit fit for a tank commander. Next came the wings. 3mm aluminum panels, reinforced by ribs that looked more architectural than aeronautical. They fired again. MG-42 first, then the 20mm cannon. Edges tore, rivets sang loose, but the structure held. Kramer touched the rim of a bullet hole. "They built it to take punishment," he said, "not to avoid it." His phrase became a line in report R-1444. They filled a fuel tank with kerosene, fired a single armor-piercing round. A flash, a hiss, and silence. The fire smothered itself. The rubberized lining had self-sealed the wound. "They even designed their fire to die," whispered Wilkie. For German engineers, it bordered on sorcery. Their own aircraft burned from the slightest spark. The Thunderbolt was lifted onto jacks, weights piled on the landing gear until the scales read 9 tons. The struts bent, groaned, but held. "You could land this on a stone wall," one mechanic said, "and still take off." He wasn't wrong. P-47s had done exactly that, landing on mud, ice, craters, and leaving again. They started the engine. 4 hours of continuous run, cylinder temperature above 200 degrees Celsius. When they stopped and opened the covers, no cracks, no failures, no mercy. "It's as if it wants to live," Kramer murmured. A German engine under such stress would have seized within an hour. They punctured an oil line deliberately. The pressure gauge didn't fall. A backup circuit had taken over automatically. On the wall, someone chalked a phrase, "Fehler ist Teil des Plans." Error is part of the plan. Kramer sat at his desk that evening, filling out the Prüfbericht Nummer 7, Feindflugzeug P-47 Thunderbolt. He wrote, "We have built machines for control. They have built machines for chaos." That was what frightened him most. The Thunderbolt didn't fear chaos. It thrived in it. When the shooting stopped, silence flooded the hangar. The officers stared at the scarred armor, the scorched panels, the canopy still unbroken. "If a pilot sat there," Brunner said softly, "he'd believe he's immortal." For comparison, they repeated the test on a FW-190. The results were merciless. Bullets sliced through the cockpit, fuel ignited. In 30 seconds, it was gone. The snow outside hissed as it met the burning metal. "We built Eagles," said Wilke. "They built Bulldogs." The official report read dryly, "Feindflugzeug P-47 zeigt außergewöhnliche strukturelle Belastbarkeit und Schadensresistenz." Enemy aircraft P-47 demonstrates exceptional structural strength and resistance to damage. But the unofficial version, copied by hand, passed quietly between engineers, ended with a single line. If Germany had this plane, the war would be different. The Thunderbolt had become something more than a subject. It was a mirror, a reminder that engineering is not pride, but endurance. Kramer closed his notebook. "In every dent of this machine," he said, "there's an idea stronger than our steel." And as the storm raged outside, the truth settled heavy in the hangar. They tried to break it. Instead, it broke their certainty. Rechlin, Germany, January 1945. Snow blanketed the airfield. The hangars stood silent, their roofs heavy with frost. The tests were over. The reports had been sent to Berlin. But in hangar number 12, one plane still remained. The Thunderbolt. Its armor was dented, propeller bent, glass cracked. And yet, it stood there with a strange presence. Everyone who entered paused for a moment, as if before something that was still listening. "It looks like it remembers," said a young technician. No more shooting, no more cutting of metal. Now the hangar held only notebooks, lamps, and quiet conversation. The engineers came not to prove, but to understand. Kramer stood by the fuselage, reading the earlier reports. His fingers traced the bullet holes as if reading the story carved into the steel. "Every mark," he said, "is a testimony of work, and every dent means someone survived." They began to feel something unsettling. When they looked at the plane, it felt as though it looked back. Even without a pilot, it seemed to remember flight. "It feels alive," said Wilke. "No," Kramer replied. "Not alive, aware." That night in his journal, Kramer wrote, "If machines can have souls, this one's is forged in steel." He remembered how the Thunderbolt had held under fire, how its engine refused to surrender, how its glass cracked but never shattered. This was more than engineering. It was character. Next to it stood a FW190, sleek, elegant, perfect in proportion. But beside the Thunderbolt, it looked fragile, ornamental, like porcelain beside an anvil. "Our planes have beauty," Kramer said. "Theirs have will." From then on, even the engineers changed their speech. They no longer called it das Flugzeug. They called it he. In early February, Kramer gathered his young engineers. He told them, "Don't copy this plane. Learn from it." He knew Germany would not win, but the Thunderbolt had left a lesson that reached beyond war. How to build not for victory, but for life. One evening, Wilke and Brunner sat beside the great R-2800 engine. They weren't talking about pistons or pressure. They were talking about people. "Do you think the Americans love their planes?" asked Wilke. "No," Brunner replied. "They love what they do." And that was it. The Americans didn't worship machines. They trusted them. For the Germans, engineering was art. For the Americans, it was empathy. The Thunderbolt was the first humane machine they had ever met, built not to glorify war, but to forgive mistakes. "This was made by people who value the man inside," said Kramer, and that realization hurt more than defeat. Outside, the Reich was collapsing. Inside, Hangar 12, silence. The engineers still came to work, not from orders, but from respect, for the thing they'd come to understand. Kramer wrote one final note. "We thought we were the best, but perhaps being best matters less than being good." They began calling it der unzerstörbare Geist, the indestructible spirit. The name never appeared in the official papers, but someone scrawled it in chalk on the board beside the door. The Thunderbolt became their quiet memorial, a reminder of what Germany had lost: simplicity, humanity, and craftsmanship without ideology. "He fights for no flag," said Brunner. "He fights to finish the job." Kramer finished his final report. He wrote, "The P-47 Thunderbolt is not merely a warplane. It is an argument for strength without cruelty." When the order came to destroy all captured aircraft, Kramer went to the hangar alone. He stood before the Thunderbolt, breathed in the smell of oil and metal, and said softly, "You survived us." He removed a small metal tag from the control panel, "Property of Republic Aviation," and slipped it into his pocket. Then he turned and left the hangar door open to the snow. "They came to dissect a machine," he wrote later. "They left having met a soul." Berlin, February 1945. Snow fell in silence over a dying city. Inside a dimly lit office of the Luftfahrt Ministerium, Dr. Walter Kramer sat before his typewriter. The order was clear: prepare a technical report for the Ministry of Aviation, a comparative analysis of German and American production. But he knew, as his fingers touched the keys, that this was not an analysis. It was a confession. The German genius had created miracles: the Me-262, the FW-190, the Tiger, the Panther. But every miracle demanded master hands, endless hours of adjustment, precision born from pride, and faith that perfection itself could save an empire. In America, it was different. Genius did not stand at a workbench. It ran the assembly line. "They industrialized genius," Kramer typed. Among his desk papers were reconnaissance photos from Farmingdale, New York, the Republic Aviation plant, a hangar the size of a cathedral, 80,000 square meters, with over 120 Thunderbolts standing in neat rows, each in a different stage of birth. Men and women worked side by side. Each section, fuselage, wings, engine, landing gear, built separately. then married on a conveyor. Every 2.5 hours, another P-47 rolled out to the runway. On the wall, "We build with pride." Kramer stared at the photo and thought, they build with rhythm. The Thunderbolt was not a triumph of technology. It was a triumph of arithmetic. A single FW-190 could outmaneuver a P-47. But while one German masterpiece destroyed one Thunderbolt, 10 more were already on the way. Between 1942 and 1945, America built over 15,000 Thunderbolts. Germany, barely 3,500 FW-190D, assembled in shortages and air raids. They don't care about masterpieces, Kramer wrote. They care about armies of copies. One photo stopped him. A woman in overalls, a rivet gun in hand. Caption, "Rosie the Riveter, we can do it." In Germany, women hid from bombs. In America, they built the planes that dropped them. They gave their war to everyone, Kramer noted. And that is why everyone will win it for them. German engineers marveled that every Thunderbolt component could be produced on any continent. Stamped numbers and part codes made each piece interchangeable, a global jigsaw of steel and faith. If a plant in Detroit was bombed, San Diego or Buffalo took over within hours. "We fight with genius," Kramer wrote. "They fight with geometry." By 1944, as Germany rationed its last barrels of fuel, America burned more gasoline in training flights than the Wehrmacht used for entire campaigns. Not waste, confidence. You can't outfight a nation that never stops making. Kramer's report included a table. Metric Germany United States aircraft per month, 807,000. Average assembly, time 1 week, 3 days. Productivity per worker, 1.2 planes, 6.8 planes. Average worker age, 35 years, 24 years. The numbers were more frightening than any weapon. "We are artisans," Kramer typed slowly. "They are a civilization of builders." The Thunderbolt, he realized, was America itself, a mirror of its society. Every rivet, every bolt, a product of faith in the ordinary person. They built their machines the same way they built their cities, with unity, not perfection. On the final page, Kramer wrote, "A German engineer believes the machine must obey him. An American engineer believes the machine must forgive him." That was not engineering. That was philosophy. American industry was human. Machines designed to survive mistakes, to protect their pilots, to tolerate imperfection and still endure. Pinned on the wall of Hangar 12 back in Rechlin was a clipping from a captured newspaper. Every 4 hours, a Thunderbolt rolls out. Beneath it, smiling workers. And a slogan, "Built by Freedom." Kramer stared at it for a long time. Germany built for glory. America built for purpose. "We worship power," he whispered. "They worship purpose." He closed the report folder and on the back page penciled the last words of his career. They didn't just build planes. They built inevitability. The Germans built masterpieces. The Americans built momentum. And momentum cannot be stopped. Berlin, March 1945. The sky was grey. The streets were rubble. Buildings gaped with bomb-cratered wounds. Inside the Luftwaffe Ministerium, in a windowless room, 6 men sat around a heavy oak table. Dr. Walter Kramer placed a folder before them. Across its cover, Technische Untersuchung, P-47 Thunderbolt. It was his last assignment. He knew the war was lost. But now he wrote not for victory, but for truth. The secretary began reading the preface. Only the scratch of a pen disturbed the silence. Kramer looked up. The officers were turning pages, filled not with pride, but with the arithmetic of defeat. "Herr Doktor," one of them asked, "Sie behaupten, das amerikanische Flugzeug ist überlegen. You claim the American aircraft is superior?" Kramer answered quietly, Nein, Herr General. Ich behaupte, Sie haben uns überholt, nicht übertroffen. No, General. I claim they have surpassed us, not outshone us. He opened the report to its first line. P-47 Thunderbolt, Beispiel industrieller Vernunft. The P-47 Thunderbolt, an example of industrial reason. He spoke of the Pratt Whitney R-2800 engine, its simplicity, its redundancy, its self-sealing fuel tanks, its parts built for mechanics, not masters. Each paragraph struck like an artillery shell against the pride of the Reich. A general slammed his fist on the table. Unser Focke-Wulf ist wendiger, schneller, schöner. Our Focke-Wulf is more agile, faster, more beautiful. Kramer nodded. Ja, aber brennt schneller. Yes, but it burns faster. Silence. The pen stopped scratching. Someone coughed. He spread out tables, production rates, material costs, assembly times, numbers that drew the line between genius and system. They build like ants, he said, and ants build mountains. That sentence would later appear in the British archives in a translated copy of the report. An engineer muttered, You can't win with simplicity. Kramer looked at him and replied, No, but you can survive with it. Then came the final section. Philosophische Bemerkungen. He read aloud. Unsere Maschinen verkörpern Stolz. Ihre verkörpern Vernunft. Our machines embody pride. Theirs embody reason. Wir bauten Waffen, zu beeindrucken. Sie bauten Werkzeuge, zu beenden. We built weapons to impress. They built tools to end. The minister closed the folder slowly. Ihre Worte sind gefährlich, Doctor. Your words are dangerous, Doctor. Kramer met his gaze. Nicht gefährlich. Wahr. Not dangerous. True. For the first time in the war, no one argued. Because everyone in that room knew. The end had already arrived. On the table lay a small metal tag, taken from the captured Thunderbolt. Property of Republic Aviation. Kramer placed it beside his report. That's their empire, he said. Not of land, but of making. On the final page, he wrote by hand. Wenn die Geschichte gerecht ist, wird sie sagen, Deutschland hatte die Ideen. Amerika hatte den Mut, sie umzusetzen. If history is just, it will say, Germany had the ideas. America had the courage to make them real. When the meeting ended, no applause came. The officers gathered their papers, the lamps dimmed, and only Kramer remained, staring at the falling ash outside. It's over, he whispered, but at least we learned. A month later, the Reich collapsed. Kramer's report was found by Allied intelligence. A translated copy reached the United States. In the margins of one American file, a pencil note was scrawled, Even the enemy understood what we built. When the war was ending, the last German words of truth were written in the language of American steel. May 1945. Europe lay in ruins. The city of Rechlin was silent. Hangar number 12 stood wide open. Inside, the same P-47 Thunderbolt once captured and tested by the Germans. It stood alone, like a ghost of war. Dust covered its wings, cracks split its canopy, but the armor still held. Weeks later, American soldiers found it. They noticed a small metal sign. Test Object Nummer 14, nicht zerstören. Test Object Number 14, do not destroy. Not knowing who wrote it, they obeyed the order and left the aircraft untouched. 1946. The Rechlin Thunderbolt was shipped to the United States. At the Republic Aviation plant, former engineers gathered to see it. Their own creation, shaped and studied by the enemy. One of them, Thomas Clayton, ran a hand across the armor and said, Looks like they learned something from him too. Meanwhile, Dr. Walter Kramer, the German engineer who once examined the aircraft, was living in an internment camp. Later, he was brought to the US under Operation Paperclip, working as a consultant for Pratt Whitney. On his first day at the new factory, he walked past a row of R-2800 engines, the same kind he had once disassembled in secret. He stopped, touched the cylinder, and whispered, "You again." The American engineers looked on curiously, not knowing this was the man who had once written of them as the victors of reason. Years later, Kramer told his students, "The war taught me that perfection is a form of fear, because when you chase it, you forget the purpose." He spoke of the Thunderbolt not as a killer, but as a machine that saved more lives than it took, a plane whose strength was forgiveness, not firepower. Through the 1950s, the P-47 served on in a dozen countries, France, Brazil, Italy, and later in Korea, escorting jet-age F-86 Sabres. American pilots laughed. The old man still got it. The Thunderbolt flew long after its makers had retired. Its engine rumbled like a reminder that durability is a kind of genius. By mid-century, the P-47 had become more than an airplane. It was proof that wars are won not by slogans or brilliance, but by hands, machines, and faith in simplicity. "He wasn't beautiful," one veteran said, "but neither is a hammer that builds your home." In the 1960s, European museums began celebrating industrial heritage. In one hall, side by side, stood a German FW-190 and an American P-47. Beneath the Thunderbolt's plaque, "Engineered to endure." Beneath the FW-190, "Engineered to excel." Two worlds, one perfect summary. 1971. Dr. Kramer visited the Smithsonian. There, gleaming under the lights, was the same Thunderbolt from Rechlin, restored, polished, but still bearing its scars. He placed a hand on the metal and said quietly, "You outlived us all." A young American engineer nearby asked, "Is it true you once tested this for the Germans?" Kramer smiled. "No, he tested us." Historian John Howard later wrote, 1983, "The P-47 was not a weapon of genius. It was a weapon of faith, in process, in people, in persistence." The Thunderbolt became the metaphor of a generation, men and women who built not for glory, but for results. In the 21st century, engineers still cite its principles: simplicity, redundancy, standardization. Those same ideas live on in every jet, every spacecraft, every computer. Perfection ends, durability lasts. That phrase is engraved on a bronze plaque at the entrance to the Republic Aviation Museum. Veteran George Milton, the pilot whose own plane had gone down in France, lived to see the 1990s. When he learned his Thunderbolt survived the war and now sat in a museum, he said, "She was built to fight, but what she really did was teach us how to build peace." At an air show in the American Midwest, a restored Thunderbolt rises into the sky. Its engine growls, smoke trailing behind, and the crowd bursts into applause. On the fuselage, the faded words remain: "No guts, no glory." History, it seems, has come full circle. They called it a beast. They called it ugly. But the Thunderbolt outlasted them all, because it was built by hands that believed endurance is beauty.